Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for watching this video, and I'm looking forward to talking to you in a couple of days. The title of my presentation is Complexity and Social Change, and it's actually an abstract version of my dissertation. So it has some claims that I'm not going to go into details for because I am sure that it's going to come up in the Q&A, and some other claims that I mentioned because I'm excited about talking about them if someone was interested. But I know that it might make things look a little busy. So I'll do my best to emphasize the parts that are important while mentioning things that I would like to talk about more with anyone who's interested. So here's a quick roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about. My end goal is to say that participating in a movement that has some qualifications is a moral imperative. I ground this claim in the pragmatist take on social movements, especially by Elizabeth Anderson, raise some problems for that, provide an alternative account based on complexity approach, and address those problems with complexity approach and make a conclusion. Well, my end goal was to say that participating in a chapter-based, leaderful, and grassroots social movement with some qualification is a moral imperative. Of course, the devil here is in details. I'm not going to go into those details, but it listed some qualifications here that I'm happy to talk about if you're interested. But why social movements? I'm going to argue that they can play a unique role that is not replaceable with top-down interventions like regulations, policy change, or bottom-up interventions with uncoordinated individual actions. I cannot just decide that, well, something is racist and I'm going to do something without thinking about what other people are going to be doing, because it's likely for that kind of deviation or that kind of resistance to just cause harm for me without making any meaningful change. In the pragmatist tradition, Elizabeth Anderson provides a very interesting and helpful argument in favor of social movements. She argues that in the presence of inequality, moral reasoning is inadequate because the norms that it relies on are created by the entitled and powerful to be used in their own claim making. So making moral progress requires creating new norms and disvaluing old norms, and social movements are necessary because they take away the power of old norms and enforce new norms. There are a variety of examples of norms that have changed throughout time, and the change was a result of a social movement that supported it. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the norms around tobacco use and money, gender norms are examples of that. Movements do this by engaging more people who can express their opposition and motivation. So the support and strength of old norms decline. Anderson argues that movements take away the power of old norms in interpersonal claim making and impose a cost on people who insist on upholding the challenge norms. So basically, they create new equilibrium states, which I'm going to talk about. Anderson follows Thierry and Taro, and I follow both of them. And they argue that social movements are sustained campaigns of claim making that use repeated performance, advertise a claim based on organizations, networks, traditions, and solidarities that sustain those activities. This is all great, but I think there are two problems that need to be addressed. The first problem is, at the end of the day, I don't have a good answer yet whether movements play a unique role to address social problems or not. And I explain in a bit what I mean by this. And the second question is whether we are morally obligated to participate in social movements if they're that good. And I'm going to address both these problems. But it is important to understand that the unique role that movements play might be undermined, or I think they're undermined, because of the ontological and methodological commitments that comes with the frameworks of explanation that people often use to understand what is their problem and how we should address it. And these ontological and methodological commitments make it look like that movements are important because they have some moral epistemic roles in the society. And if that's so, norms or epistemic failures are the main cause of the problems. And if we fix that, everything gonna be fixed. But I think the problem's more than that. And they don't explain why aiming for top-down policy change, for instance, is not working. It's much easier to call representatives and pressure them to do something instead of doing years of organizing, community activism and engagement and the like. And they don't explain how new norms can be created in a way that it's immune to the problems of the old norms. There are many problems that are directly also relevant to the frameworks of explanation. And I think paying attention to them also helps to explain why we dismiss the role that movements play and whether they do play actually a unique role or not. The dichotomy between individuals and groups, individual and structures, the debate about what causation even mean when we're explaining things and at what level causation happens, what kind of heuristic tools we can use to be able to identify a problem, address them, and how central should be stability, robustness, and equilibrium states that help us to generalize the problems that we are trying to explain are just a few examples of problems that have been discussed when it comes to social explanation. But the reality, I think, is that society is a very complex system composed of many agents who are active and interacting with one another and simultaneously affecting the actions and decisions of others while they're influenced by others. And when you think of society that way, well, then instead of a dichotomy between individuals and higher level entities, you see that the boundaries are kind of blurry, or they at least have a mutually dependent relationship between individuals and groups. This conversation has been around since maybe early 1900 in social science and sociology, but also in other fields like biology that can be, to some extent, easier to verify things empirically and show that kind of mutual relationship between different levels of explanation. And I think we need to learn from that. Also, when it comes to many agents interacting simultaneously with one another, the way that they're connected to each other becomes important. And sometimes the way that they're connected to one another make it such that decomposition and localization is very helpful. We can decompose society to clusters of individuals who are interacting with one another with some frequency and understand their dynamics and then add things up together. But some other times it's not simply possible, and we might need some alternative tools to be able to understand the phenomena of interest and be able to identify potential sites for change. And also, we cannot always assume that societies are in equilibrium states, as many social theorists and philosophers especially like to do. We sometimes exist far from equilibrium states, but at the same time, we are seeing very meaningful pattern of behavior that needs explanation. So the pragmatist response, as well as actually critical race theory to a great extent, by which I'm thinking about people like Sally Haslanger or Elizabeth Anderson fail to address the unique role of social movements because they use particular frameworks of explanation that's not equipped to theorize how change happens. But as I said, if we think of society as a dynamic system, a system composed of many active agents that their behaviors simultaneously affect one another, network effect becomes an important part because who is influencing who to what extent is a relevant piece of information that we need to explain things. Thinking about society that way also shows that, well, we can have heterogeneity at the individual or different levels, and that kind of difference in individuals' traits, beliefs, habits explains things, and dismissing that piece of information by only focusing at one level of explanation is often harmful. The system becomes dynamic also because that network of social relations creates feedback loops, not just feedback loops that are correcting individuals' deviations from norms or what people expect them to do, but also amplifies when right kind of people are connected to one another. But also it means that coordination is necessary to address problems when we have all these feedback loops that creates problems at many different levels that are simultaneously influencing one another. We also will have nonlinear and stochastic relationships because when we have reinforcing feedback loops, it means some random effect at some level that we didn't expect before can create change that is observable at a very large scale. But also it means that wrong interventions can have adverse effects when they disrupt people's interaction with one another in a way that they all understand or expect. When it comes to explaining public health problems, this kind of problem also comes up because we used to, for instance, focus on individuals and their habits and try to fix different problems that come to the social life by holding people accountable and addressing those problems. But a more comprehensive picture can show that there are many pieces of puzzles that need to go together and does go together in order to create a social level phenomena. Here it's the growth of obesity in the United States, and focusing on one aspect without addressing others is just useless because feedback loops gonna create new or same problems over and over again. There are two other features of complex and dynamic systems, emergence and self-organization, that are also very important, but I'm not going to have time to talk about them. But why all these matter for theorizing social change? So take that idea of heterogeneity, for instance, that we have heterogeneity at the individual level. People have different habits or different goals. But the way that we often understand culture or understand cultural norm implies that culture is something like an equilibrium of individual strategic responses. This is the Anderson account when she talks about an economic approach to culture. So equilibrium of individual strategic responses to each other's conduct within the constraint of their resources and opportunities. And when we are talking about equilibrium states, by definition, it means that it's very hard to get out of them if it's not impossible. Something like what we're seeing on the left side of the slide. But in reality, things are more like things on the right side of the slide, especially when we take into account the fact that individuals' connections to one another creates this kind of equilibrium states. And when you change the connectivity level between individuals or connect individuals who were not connected to one another before, you can destabilize the equilibrium states, and get out of them by increasing the energy level, if I want to use physics terms, and make change possible. But the problem might be how to get from point A to point B. One example of the effect of changing connectivity level is the banking system. First, notice that the better connected countries, and that it's like, and this graph is shown in 1990s, are more powerful than the less connected ones, and arguably the more connected ones have the ability to exploit others. And what I want to get to at the end of this presentation is to say that, well, social movements are important because they are kind of like intervening in a network like this, but connecting people who are not connected to one another already to create new superpowers. So if power is the ability to interact with many other individuals, you can create new networks of social relations that are kind of equally powerful and change the dynamic of social interactions by doing so. But it's important to pay attention that it's not easy to just change social networks or social relations, because sometimes doing so just means more powerful people will already have enough power. So the social movements need to do that strategically, so the connections would not be exploitable by the most connected ones. This is right before the 2008 financial crisis, and as you can see that like some of these banks or countries are very, very powerful, and that power on its own has made the system very stable. So what are the problems with the frameworks of explanation that fail to see the unique role of social movements? Well, they have descriptive and normative problems. The descriptive problem is that they systematically underdetermine parts of the problem or aspects of the system that are relevant to the explanation. So, for instance, the dichotomy between individuals and groups makes it look like there is nothing that happens in between them or connects them together, or focusing on one is enough and we can dismiss the others. They also fail to capture how change happens, because they mean that most often that we live in equilibrium states when we are cooperating with one another. However, in reality, we live far from equilibrium states, and many aspects of our social realities can change and do change. There's also a normative problem, because those traditional frameworks of explanation misguide our moral response to social problems. So social movements are necessary because society is a complex and adaptive system, and we need synchronized interventions at many different levels to be able to create a sustainable form of change. And the site of intervention are not isolated or minimally interactive, in the sense that we cannot just focus on economy, for instance, without paying attention to public health, or to environment without paying attention to other aspects of the society. And we need people from all walks of life to contribute to help us go from point A to point B. So in response to the question about whether movements play a unique role or not, I would say, well, top-down interventions fail because they often dismiss the effect of individuals' resistance or deviation to that kind of intervention. Uncoordinated individual action also fails because it's costly for individuals often to deviate from those expectations that society puts on them. And social movements are helpful because they solve the coordination problem for individuals and institutions by creating an alternative network of social relation that makes that possible. They also destabilize social order by changing the network of social relations. Okay, so second problem was about whether we're morally obligated to participate in movements if they're that good. And I think most people think about social problems as if there's a well-defined problem and there's a well-defined solution. And all we need to do is to push that solution piece of the puzzle into the hole. But I think things are a little bit more complicated than that. I'll explain how and why. So in order to answer whether we are morally obligated to participate in movement, I think we should at least answer 3 sets of questions. The first one is it even justified to participate in a movement to begin with before even we start the conversation about obligation. And to answer this question, we should see whether progress is even possible, it's sustainable, whether it leads to backlash because we messed up somewhere. Are we exposed to something like a bandwagon effect that people start jumping into bad conclusions just because the people around them do so? Are we providing incentives for people to abuse their power or this new network of social relation or this change in norms? That's what economists call moral hazard and many, many other problems. And the second question is whether it's a moral imperative without any responsibility about the outcomes. How should I know whether my contribution to this movement actually helps and not hurts? And if it does, am I responsible for the harm that it causes? And whether and to what extent a movement can be demanding. These are very important problems. I'm not going to get to all of them, but at least I can say this, that if we focus on structures of cooperation or the network of social relations, we can say meaningful things that can address at least some of these problems and questions that people often talk about. This is a paper by 2 economists. I can share the resources or the references later if you want me to, but they are talking about how we can collectively solve problems and how good or bad will be the quality of those solutions that we find. So they create this model. It's composed of 40 agents that are fully connected, meaning that each agent is connected to 39 other agents in their network. And you can see that information, as you can guess, travels very fast because everything that an individual finds, it can be transferred to everyone else immediately. And the individual's job is to try things by try and error and share their answer with their neighbors and compare their answer and see how good the answer is. And if it's good enough, or good than others' answers, keep it. If someone else's answer is better, then they copy their neighbor's answer. Information travels in this structure very quickly. You can see the high level of coordination is very possible, but it also has very poor outcome and creates echo chambers that are very dangerous. So you see 3 charts here in this slide that shows how much time it takes for individuals to get convinced that they've got a good enough answer and the average quality of their score, which is not very impressive. I ran this 3 times and you see every time it has a different answer. I cannot even predict how good of an answer it will be, but I can say on average, it's not very impressive. Now compare this with a network in which each individual or even the same individuals are connected to only 4 others. You can see that information travels very slowly, coordination will be very hard, but they are getting much better outcomes, as you can see in the 3 graphs in this slide. The caveat is that it takes them a very long time to get there, but they can trust their own experiences and not stop looking before they should, and get convinced that their answer is good enough. So many scholars in sociology and in conversations about social movements argue that chapter-based movements are particularly good approaches or good kinds of social movements. They're very successful, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving is like one of the famous examples that comes up over and over again, and many others. And they create very sustainable, effective forms of social change. And you can see that the network of this kind of chapter-based movements is like a combination of the two structures that I mentioned earlier. So at the local level, you have well-connected networks with very high levels of clustering. But at the global level, you can see that those clusters are weakly connected to others. So coordination at the local level is very quick. Information travels very fast. But these collectives can think about their problems in their own context and digest the information and compare their answers with their neighbors or neighbor clusters and have enough time to figure out whether their answer is better than others without having the bandwagon effect or without landing to bad conclusions. And in fact, we can show that the quality of the answers in this combination is very high, and the time is somewhere in the middle. It's moderate enough to be a reliable form of solving a problem or finding a solution. So going back to the original problems that I discussed, the first one was whether movements play a unique role or not, and the lack of answer for that. So I argued that they solve coordination problem. They put social systems at a critical stage that allows them to change by changing the connectivity level. They make change sustainable through changing the structure of social relations that I didn't discuss much in this presentation, but I'm happy to talk about. The second problem was whether we are morally obligated to participate in the social movements, and things that I've shown by now. First one was that chapter-based movements provide the best structure of complex problem solving. This means that we can minimize the harms of intervention by engaging more people and have a better quality for answer, because the information necessary to know where to intervene and how is radically disseminated. And we need engagement from very different people from different walks of life. And movements can potentially provide that for us. And of course, they reduce the cost of participation because they create new networks that reduces the cost of deviation and creates protection. I can talk about that more too. But the last piece to answer whether we're morally obligated to participate is this argument that I built on Peter Singer's argument. And here is the parts of the argument. So I wanted to say that participating in a grassroots social movement is a moral imperative. It should be chapter-based, actually. So the first premise that there's a complex problem with moral significance, such as racial oppression and inequality. Second, the presence of morally significant problem. If one can do something effective without sacrificing anything of moral importance, acting is a moral imperative, as Peter Singer argued. Participating in a grassroots and chapter-based social movement is an effective way to remedy the problem, I argued. And participating in social movements for most people does not require sacrificing anything of moral importance, at least to the extent that it doesn't. And the conclusion is that participating in the social movement is a moral imperative. Thank you very much. And I'm looking for having a good conversation about this topic.